Well, welcome. I'm Guy Newland. I'm pinch hitting tonight for Venerable Chardron, who's not able to be here. Since we're going to be talking about emptiness in this session, let's start by setting our motivation in regard to that. Like Kisa Gotami was at the time of the Buddha, we are maddened, made crazy by the delusion of ignorance, and try to grasp what is ungraspable, whirling in the prison of cyclic existence. Given that understanding emptiness in a profound way is the key that will free us and our mothers from this prison, may we, through listening well today, take another step towards being able to set them in the total happiness of Buddhahood. So, as I was saying there in the setting our motivation, we're going to be talking today about what the subtle form of ignorance is, the most basic form of ignorance that binds us in cyclic existence, according to Tsongkhapa's system, which is following the Prasangika Madhyamaka. We have a lot of different types of ignorance. Like earlier today, the kinds of things we were talking about is that I don't even understand very well the emptiness of things being permanent. But this is much subtler than that. And nonetheless, it's considered in the tradition to be only a slightly hidden phenomenon, which means that we can understand it with the human mind through conceptual analysis. It's not just some ineffable thing that only a Buddha can figure out. So, even though it seems difficult, this is part of the path for us to work on that. Venerable Tarba and I were talking today about how in the beginning of Tsongkhapa's exposition of the stages of the path to enlightenment, he explains that everything in the book should be taken as personal instructions for practice. And he says it like addressing the reader in the second person, not one should. So it's pretty daunting to keep that in mind as you get to this particular section where Tsongkhapa identifies precisely the object of negation, that is what it is that emptiness is the lack of, what it is that through grasping ignorance binds us in cyclic existence, because it's not as easy to understand as permanence, let's say. Okay, so this is on page 212 of the third volume of the great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment. And this is general. This is a very good chapter to read. It's called The Actual Object to be Negated. In a sense, Tsongkhapa has come to the part of the practice of the path where you try to identify the object of negation so that you can then refute it and realize emptiness. But you have to know exactly what you're refuting. And he spent a long time going through all the wrong ideas that various people have had. And then he finally comes to this chapter where he's going to tell you what he himself thinks. So it's an important chapter, chapter 17 in volume 3. It has a number of interesting things in it besides the part we're going to read today. But say if the most important sentence in this chapter is there in the middle of page 212. Here we see that someone is asking a hypothetical question. How does ignorance superimpose intrinsic nature? And Tsongkhapa says, in general, there appear in Chandrakirti's text many usages of verbal conventions such as nature or essence with regard to objects that exist only conventionally. But there's one specific sense that we're talking about when we talk about the subtle ignorance that binds us in cyclic existence. And here he tells us what he thinks it is. Here, in the case of the reification by ignorance, there is, with regard to objects, be they persons or other phenomena, a conception that those phenomena have ontological status, a way of existing in and of themselves, without being posited through the force of an awareness. Okay, so that's in his whole 3 volumes, that's the sentence, the one that starts with however there, where he actually states the object of negation for his own position. And then the next sentence defines what the ignorance is that binds us in cyclic existence. The referent object that is apprehended by that ignorant conception, the independent ontological status of those phenomena, is identified as a hypothetical self or intrinsic nature. So, ignorance grasp at objects as having, reifies objects, superimposes onto objects some kind of way of existing in and of themselves. And then what that means is, it doesn't mean in and of themselves without depending on causes and conditions. It doesn't mean in and of themselves without depending on their parts. It means in and of themselves in the sense of without being posited through the force of an awareness. In other words, somehow things exist, but they can't exist without somehow depending on the force of an awareness. And insofar as we think the opposite of that, that's the ignorance that we're talking about. Okay, so that's super important paragraph in this whole book, and it's sort of the starting point, I think, for talking about this today. Let's, I guess we would hope that Tsongkhapa explains this to us a little better. And after explaining how he gets this out of Aryadeva and Chandrakirti, toward the bottom paragraph on 212, he tries to explain what he said. Therefore, autonomously, or we could say autonomous existence, refers to the nature of an object that has its own unique ontological status or mode of being. It is just this that is called essence or intrinsic nature. And then he gives an example that is very much like the example that we'll be discussing later, and also like the example that His Holiness the Dalai Lama was meditating on when he had this experience of insight that he describes in How to See Yourself as You Really Are. Take, for example, the case of an imaginary snake that is mistakenly ascribed to a rope. So, everybody who's read any Indian philosophy at that point, their eyes start to glaze over because they've already heard 500 examples like this, even though none of us have ever actually mistaken a rope for a snake. And but the next sentence is what blows it open, and that other people haven't done. He says, now, if we leave aside how it is ascribed from the perspective that apprehends a snake, leave that aside. There's a mistaken perspective that's designating this rope as a snake. Now let's leave aside that perspective of that and consider how the snake exists in terms of its own nature, right? Since a snake is simply not present in that object, its features can't be analyzed. And it's similar to that in regard to these phenomena. Okay, the kind of self of persons, the kind of intrinsic nature, that we think that things have, doesn't exist in things at all. And correctly, the way things exist is that they're established by being ascribed and designated. That's how they exist conventionally. That's not bad. The problem is that when you think that they have some other way of existing that's more than that, that like can come from the outside of the object without having to count on the perspective being seen in a certain perspective. So going on with that, he says, it's similar with regard to all these phenomena. Suppose that we leave aside some analysis of how they appear to this or that conventional awareness, like a bat or a person or a hungry ghost. Let's leave that all aside, how they appear to some person's mind, and instead just analyze the objects themselves and say, how do these things exist? We'll find that they're not established in any way. That is, when we set aside, he's not saying they don't exist. He's saying when we set aside the issue of their being involved with a perspective that sees them as that, then they're not established in any way. That's the point. But ignorance doesn't apprehend phenomena in the way we've just described. And in fact, it apprehends it in precisely the opposite. Ignorance apprehends each phenomenon as having a manner of being such that it can be understood in and of itself without being posited through the force of a conventional consciousness. Okay, so that's our, I guess, primary, ultimate root text for today's discussion. Should I just leave it there? Is that all?
Thank you.
Yeah, it's good teaching. But seriously, you should go back and read that over and over again. I've read it over and over again, trying to figure out why the words are just the way they are. And I know that the Dalai Lama has done it too. And, I should mention that, so in these two particular books, How to See Yourself as You Really Are and The Middle Way by the Dalai Lama. So these books are intended to be accessible texts. They're sold a lot of copies, and they're written in a very or at least relatively accessible way. But don't underestimate them. If you know what you're looking for and you read very, very carefully, you can find His Holiness talking about exactly what he thinks this means, right? So in The Middle Way, for example, you'll want to be looking at page 102.
What page?
102, where he says, in the proper understanding of Nagarjuna's philosophy, it's not just that phenomena are dependent on their component parts, but if we probe among those parts, we cannot find anything that we can point to and say, here's the real thing. Here's its defining characteristics. Here's its defining characteristic. Things come to be known as particular things. That's a really important phrase. It's helped me. Things come to be known as this or that, only on the basis of their designative basis, or their basis. Jeffrey's going to call it bases of imputation, and Jimba here is translated as their designative bases. Dependent designation then means that things exist by way of being labeled upon a suitable basis, or we could say through worldly convention. In other words, they are dependent on their designation by mind conceiving them, because all phenomena in the final analysis are conceptual labels applied upon aggregations of certain bases. And then, of course, all the aggregations, every part of the aggregation that constitutes the basis is also an object that's been imputed, right? Because you can't go down to the quark level and find that there's just something there that's there from its own side. Okay, so yeah, that's the paragraph, and it has, the wording of it is important, and it could be overlooked because of the level at which some parts of the book are written, but the language there is very carefully chosen and helpful, and of course, in How to See Yourself as You Really Are, you want to be, for this topic, looking at chapter 20. And where he comes to this question after talking about his experience, understanding emptiness himself, on page 189, he's talking about this issue of what it means for things to be conceptually imputed or designated by the mind. He says, indeed, external objects are part of the process of generating consciousness of them. Very important. There are external objects in prasangika, as in the case of seeing a tree and its surroundings. But if dependence on thought meant that a conceptual thought is needed to construct each and everything we see, this would be absurd. So that is also what all of the geishis that I've consulted say, that it's not the case that imputation by conceptual thought means that each and everything we see is like constantly being imputed by conceptual thought, and therefore if there's no one watching, the thing isn't there. It doesn't mean that. And so what does it mean? And here he says, therefore it seems to me that in the end, the meaning of the worlds being established by conceptual thought is that objects, without depending on a consciousness, cannot establish their existence right within themselves. And it's from this point of view, it's with this meaning that it's said that persons and things are set up by conceptual thought. So, there's more before that and after that, but that's the paragraph on page 189 that's precisely on this point. There's a lot of discussions of this in other books and from different Gelugpa teachers. I've heard slightly different kinds of ways of understanding this, but the way the Dalai Lama is explaining it is in line with what Khenser Yeshe Thupten told Anne Klein in Path to the Middle, and also what 3 different geishas have told me. So how can we then, I'll just give my little outline of what this means that the prasangika view is according to Tsongkhapa. And then after I explain that, then we'll transition into trying to how we could start to work with that in practice by exploring a Dharma talk that Jeffrey Hopkins gave. So first of all, as we noticed in the precise wording of His Holiness's passage, Prasangika Madhyamaka holds that there are external objects. But what are they? It's, you can't say except in relationship to a certain perspective. That's the point. They don't exist as we imagine them to be. Like some people think, yeah, they're external objects and they're over there on their own side, but like some people take them as pleasant and some people take them as not so pleasant. Like William Blake has this passage where he says, some people see a tree and it's so beautiful they cry, and other people look at the same tree and it's just a green thing in the way. Okay, so, you could be more charitable in a reading of Blake, but I'll take it that he thinks there's a tree that's actually out there from its own side, and then different people come along and frame it in a different way. And that's not what this is saying, okay? It's saying something more disturbing than that, more disruptive of our ordinary way of seeing the world. So even though there are external objects, we can't say or know anything about what they are on their own side or in themselves. We can only know what they are in relationship to a particular mind, a particular perspective, a particular conventional consciousness is the word that Tsongkhapa uses a lot. And so I thought, if you just take that much, and if you've studied any Western philosophy, it could sound like Kant. Immanuel Kant has this view that there are objects out there, but because we can never get outside our own heads, we can never go around back and see what they are from their own side. They are something from their own side. They have their own mode of being. It's just that we can't get at it, all right? But God can. So that establishes them, roughly speaking. Now I've read Kant. Anyway, the point is that it's a little bit more dire than that. It's not just that, things like trees are out there, but we can't really get outside our heads and see what they are. It's that there isn't anything that they are in and of themselves. Yeah, so, that's the view. So they're external objects, but there isn't anything that they are in and of themselves. That's the way I've got it. So, for example, you could say that this is all this talk is in terms of conventionally. I put just conventionally after every sentence, right? So, unless I say ultimately, it's conventionally. Okay, so conventionally, an external object can be X, correctly identified as X from one point of view, and Y from another correct conventional consciousness point of view, and Z from another correct conventional consciousness point of view, all at the same time, even if X, Y, and Z are mutually contradictory. And that's where you're like going off the rails in terms of like, okay, how can that be? Well, because stuff isn't the way we think it is. It doesn't exist the way we think. If you're kind of like thinking, well, basically things are made out of material, and so they're real out there, but people like look at them in different ways because they can't help it. That's not the view that's being taught here. That maybe is a view that we could explore, but it's not the view that's here. So, for example, I can give some different examples, but for example, there was a rainbow in the sky earlier from our point of view. And we conventionally, correctly identified a rainbow, right? But there could be other beings around here who have correct conventional consciousnesses that didn't see a rainbow even while looking in the same direction. And there could be other humans, like on the opposite mountain, who, because of the way that the phenomena was in the sky, look in the same space at the same time and see no rainbow. So this is an easy place to start. A rainbow we take to be something that exists, but its existence, we can easily understand, its existence depends on a point of view. You can't, separate those two. So that's like a good example from the point, I think, of understanding this point of view stuff. The traditional example that's used is to talk about gods, ghosts, and humans going down to the river. And, the gods see nectar, and the ghosts see pus and blood, and the humans see water, and they're all correct. All right? So, in Chittamatra system, that's used to prove that there's nothing outside the mind. But here in this system, there are external objects. There are objects that are of different nature in mind. And yet all these different beings are correctly seeing something different in the same place. Because, when I hear about this, I say, oh, well, of course there's water there, but these, ghosts have that terrible ghost karma, and the gods have their special god karma that makes them see water as nectar. There you go. But it's not that, of course, right? It's not. If the gods saw it as water, that would imply that there was something wrong with the god's mind. Do you see what I'm saying? If the hungry ghost saw it as water, there would be something, very peculiar about their sense faculties that were actually not correct from a hungry ghost point of view. So an example I was thinking about today is like, we take this to be the Abbey. And conventionally, from our point of view, we're exactly correct. It is the Abbey. But there's also other beings right here, right now, who correctly discern no Abbey in the same place and time that we discern Abbey. So that seems strange, but that's the way it is. It's not just like, oh well, they're bugs, they can't see it the way it is, or they're birds, they wouldn't understand. No, it's like their perspective is just as correct as ours. So So that you don't usually hear it say, but if you understand that you can move around to different kinds of perspectives, you actually can say that there is both an Abbey and a non-Abbey here, even conventionally. But you have to make it clear that you're not talking about from the same point of view. All right? That was something I just thought of today, that we could say the Abbey. Usually if people say that the Abbey neither exists nor doesn't exist, then they're talking about ultimately. But this is, you know what I'm saying? Right? You can always say that. There's no attainment, there's no non-attainment. Ultimately. Right? Yeah. Here I'm saying there's Abbey and not Abbey, even conventionally, if not from a human point of view, but by shifting what kind of perspective we're talking about. Okay. So, external objects exist, but they have no way of existing from their own side. So how do they exist? They exist as designations or imputations or labels or ascriptions. People use different words. It seems like Lama Sopa likes to say labels. Jeffrey likes to say designations. So, some people say imputations. They're just trying to figure out how to talk about this way in which we participate in constituting an external object as X or Y. Yeah. And so that's the correct, in other words, we're not talking right at this moment about ignorance. We're talking about the way that conventional things exist. They exist as imputations. So you don't get confused and think, oh, that imputing mind is wrong. That's the conventionally valid mind that, that identifies things at the conventional level as this or that. So we're going to be talking more about designation, but this is mostly we're talking about correct designation. The ignorance part is when you think that something has some other way of existing that's beyond that. Okay, that's where we go wrong. So a way that Geshe Benden helped me understand this back in 1985 in Delhi was we were sitting around and there was a table like this, and he said, "This table is not made of atoms." And I was like, well, I didn't know that. I thought that it was. Are you saying that Prasangika doesn't believe in atoms? No, they're atoms. They're tables. But as soon as you start thinking that the table is made out of atoms, you've missed the view. It's like the table is not, if a table were made out of atoms, it would have its own way of being. It would be established via atomic construction, right? And so it's like when you think like that trees are made out of wood and so forth, you're missing what's being said here. The table exists by way of designation or imputation to a whole bunch of things that are not table. And nonetheless, that imputation can be the correct conventional way that things work. That's what they're saying. So there's a bunch, there's some stuff here, legs and the flat top and so forth, and they're arranged in a certain way. And then we designate that at a table, even though none of the parts individually, nor the collection spread out on the floor is a table, but we can designate that as a table. But then, like the legs, it's the same thing. We just designate them as legs, and so forth, based on their basis of designation. That's how things exist. So thinking that things are not merely imputed in this way, but have some other, something or other over on their own side, that's, according to Tsongkhapa, reading of Chandrakirti, that's the root of cyclic existence. Actually, he says on the page we were reading up above that that's the first link in the 12 links of dependent arising. So to understand what it means to have an ignorance that's thinking that things or conceiving that things are not merely imputed, we have to explore in practice what's going on here, how things do exist, what the status of things is conventionally, and then realize that that's very different from and that ignorance is the mind that keeps pushing back against this understanding of things as merely imputed, because it wants to hold on to the idea that things have more substance on their own side. So everything. It's hard to get used to the idea that everything we see, everything we hear, all the objects that we experience are imputed. That's enough for them to exist. The example of the A, that you've done before is easy. It's like, okay, so an A we can understand even. In the conventional world, it's understood that letters are conventions. So, sort of like using a dream to talk about how this world is, we can use, the convention within a convention of the letter A to sort of explore this. If you write, these shapes up on the board, the proper angles and the crossbar, then and you say, what's that? Everyone says, oh, that's an A. And then if you say, well, how did that get to be an A? Is it from this line or this line or this line? Or we could line up those three lines spread out, not in the right shape. And so how does it get to be an A? And then it's very easy for people to think about that there's nothing over there on the blackboard or the paper that constitutes that as an A, that we're, I think, pretty obviously involved in imputing that or assigning that or designating it as an A, and that even so, it works really well. It doesn't need to be more than that in order to work. So merely imputed things can be functional, effective. And then, if you can get people, if you get to think about this, like, oh, it feels like that A is coming off the board, but I can just stop and think for a second and realize, no, it's really coming from over here. But then if you get to that, you can say, oh yeah, but what was that mind a minute ago that felt like it was coming from the board? Ah, there you got it. Like that's our way of getting something that at a little bit lower level, it maps to what's going on here. We can catch ourselves having a mind that thinks that the A is out there, and we're just passively receiving a message about it from its side. We can catch ourselves having that mind, and we can recognize that mind's wrong. Well, it's like that. Now if you just do that with an A and you say, oh yeah, and it's the same with the mountain. Okay, then you're done. It doesn't feel like it's the same with the mountain, right? But that's actually the view. Yeah. Okay, so in order to try to work our way into this view, I'm going to read or perform an edited Dharma talk that Jeffrey gave, trying to lead people in the way that he does, Jeffrey Hopkins, through this process of thinking about things as merely designated. Because they exist but have no independent status, things exist just by way of being designated to a basis of designation. And this is a key idea in Buddhism. We may not know what these words mean. We don't think about them all the time, but maybe we should think about them more. Because to see what emptiness is about, to see how it is that things exist, even though empty, we have to understand. For each and everything that exists, there's a basis of designation and an object designated. Yeah. One of my teachers told me he said you shouldn't go around worrying about like which conceptual thought designated which object. The point is, it's like the measure of how real things are. That's how you use like the Tibetan word for limit or measure. This like gives you a gauge on how real they are. In the case of a table, the table itself is the object designated. It's imputed, ascribed, or designated in relationship to a basis of designation, the collection of table parts, the top and the four legs. The object designated is not the word, quote, table, unquote. And that's important to say because, I mean, that's another phenomenon that exists, is the word table. What's the basis of designation of the word table? 5 letters. It is arranged in a certain way, right? But that's not the basis of designation of the table. The table's basis of designation is the top and the 4 legs, arranged in a certain way. So for this, Ananda house, we could say the basis of designation is the walls, the roof, the floors, and however many rooms are in here and so forth. There's lights. Oh, there's a fan. Yeah, and so you can look at the fan and say, oh, that's an object that's merely designated. What is the basis of designation? There's shapes and colors of the blades and the housing and the thing that comes down from the ceiling. And then when we see that, we go, fan, we designate that as a fan. The rug is the same thing. Everything is like this. The rug is designation in relationship to there being fibers, a lot of them that are woven together in a certain way, and not just a big pile of fibers over on the floor in the kitchen. So what about a person? The basis of designation of the person we could say is the shape of the human body, but if we said that and then we had a corpse, we would have to realize that that is not what we would designate a person. So maybe we could explore, at least provisionally, the idea of saying that the person is designated in relationship to the body and the stream of consciousness. And you say, oh, that's the basis of designation of the person. Well, then the body must be, real. No, the body itself is an object designated in relationship to skin and bone, blood, and all the various organs and so forth, right? And that's the way it goes. So then what about a book? The book has 510 pages. These pages must be part of the basis of designation. But we can go through and point at each page one after another. Say, is this the book? No. The book has some information, but is this particular page the book? No. Is this other page? No. And after a while, it makes you want to squirm because there is a book out there, but the closer you look, the less clear it becomes. As Holiness has often talked about that. If things had their own nature from their own side, then when we looked closely, it would get clearer. But in fact, it just keeps getting less clear. Yeah. We want something specific to point out, something we can grab. We want to be able to say, this right here is the book. I can point at any page and say, is this the book? And little children tend to ask these kinds of annoying questions, boring, irritating questions, like if there's a dozen eggs, is the third egg the dozen? No. It's a non-dozen. What about the fourth egg? Is it the dozen? No. It's a non-dozen. Let's think about something else. We don't want to face this question. We dismiss it as trivial and try to change the topic. But if you visualize 12 eggs in front of you, the 6th egg is not the dozen. 7th egg is it a dozen or a non-dozen? It's a non-dozen. You look at all of them one by one, and they're each non-dozen. So something that is not the dozen is the basis of designation of the dozen. This is what he's trying to say, is that another way to talk about this prasangika view is that, there are objects imputed. That's how things exist. But you can't find them among their bases of designation. And this is disturbing. We would really rather not see it that way. We feel, based on the appearances of things and habituation, that the dozen is right there. There's a dozen eggs. So maybe you could say that all the eggs are the dozen. But if each of them individually is non-dozen, maybe all of them together are the dozen. But then Jeffrey says, what's the difference between saying each of them and saying all of them? The difference is like a gesture, kind of designation that we're putting on top of the eggs, imagining of something called all that covers all of these non-dozens and unites them into a dozen. Where is this all that is the dozen if each and every egg is non-dozen? That's what he says. So you can think about the body, which has trunk and some limbs. Maybe you could say a head also, if you, unless you count the head as one of the limbs, which some apparently older Tibetans thought. But now we'll say for now that the body has 4 limbs, a head, and a trunk. So is the left arm your body? You have to say yes or no, because there's a body here, and so you have to say no. Is your right arm your body? Well, by your body, we mean your body that has 4 limbs, a head, and a trunk. So no. It's in your left leg, your right leg, your head, your trunk. When someone says, "Where is Guy?" you point at him. But what do we mean by him? We're pointing at his body. We're referring to a person and pointing out a body, part of his basis of designation. Or somebody comes in and has a letter. We say, "Oh, that letter's for her," and we point at the person's body. So beyond the end of the finger, we have a sense that she exists out there, a recipient of the letter, covering a spot, just the way the dozen covers a certain area. Now, when you think my body, we think of our bodies as fully covering a certain space. But clearly the part that covers the top half of that space does not cover the bottom half. And people don't want to think about that. It's unsettling. So we feel an impulse to just skip on to something else. Like if you had a hot dog for lunch, then, which we didn't, what would be the basis of designation of a hot dog? There's the left side of the hot dog and there's the right side of the hot dog. The whole hot dog is 7 inches long. So is the right side of a hot dog, is the right side of the hot dog a hot dog that's 7 inches long? Is the left side a hot dog that's 7 inches long? No. We can't find the hot dog there among the hot dog's bases of designation. It's just the same. Our bodies are like big hot dogs, is what he's saying. I just got it. Things seem to have a certain status that they do not actually have. They seem to have a certain solidity or concreteness. We could think of this as pointability. So the door, there's a door to this room. It really seems to cover a certain whole area. And it would seem, very unreasonable to think or to say that it doesn't cover that space from top to bottom. So it's hard to open up a mental space to even ask about the door's basis of designation. But there's the front side of the door, the back side of the door, the bottom of the door, the top of the door, however we divide it up mentally. And it really disturbs our assumptions when we start going around asking ourselves or thinking with everything we encounter, what's the basis of designation here? What's the object designated? Basically, that's what he's suggesting, is that we should practice this, right? Which kind of, it changes the way it is a first step toward undermining ignorance, to start thinking about, oh, this is the way things are, not the way I was assuming. So we call this kind of analysis madhyamaka, the middle way. It involves searching for the objects that's been designated, the table, the person, searching for that object among its bases of designation. This will counteract our belief in the false status of things as concrete and independent. It's like child's play. When I was a young kid, moved in next door and he asked questions like, so as he would say, is this page the book? No. Then is this page the book? Now, some people, philosophers, might not, buy this, and they might say that madhyamikas with this reasoning are somehow pulling the wool over their own eyes. And Jeffrey says, if that were true, it would have to be right here in this analysis. And suppose somebody were telling us that, we suffer needlessly because we conceive books to be elephants, and then here's my magic elephant remover, only $19.99. Something like that, So we look among the books to see if there's an elephant. Is this the elephant? No. What about this? And after a while, they say, oh, you've realized the emptiness of elephant in the book. So what? It's just a trick. In the first place, I never thought or felt that there was an elephant in the book. And like that, I never actually claimed that my right arm was my left arm. I never said the first page was the second page. I never claimed that the first page is the whole book. I never supposed that I could just rip one page out and hand that to someone and say, here's the book. So what's the relevance of this? He says, but it's really not like that. He said, this is when we point it to the car in the driveway, we really do have a sense that there's something out there that we can point to that covers the whole space beyond the end of our pointing finger. We don't think that we don't go around thinking, oh, the back bumper is the front bumper. No. But maybe we do think there's some special entity out there that exists in both the back bumper and the front bumper, and is the car nature that unites these things, right? In any case, the car that we worry about and fight over and try to protect is the car that we can point out at the end of our pointing finger. And being able to be pointed out and pinned down in this way would imply that the car, had some existence from its own side, as though it had some way of existing out there apart from being mentally designated as a car. So I'll skip a little bit here in the interest of time when he's talking about the letter A, which we did. He goes through the letter A, which we discussed, and then he says, when I was little, I would sit at my father's knee and grab a finger, and I would say, is this your hand? And this really bothered him. I grew up, and I'm still asking the same disturbing questions. Right? I think we should do the example of the rope snake. Have you ever seen a rope as a snake? This is the most common example in Indian texts, and it's very powerful, but it's not something we often encounter in our lives. What about maybe mistaking a mannequin for a human, or once in a while we might mistake a mirror image for an actual person, especially if the mirror is very clean and we weren't expecting it to be there. In any case, the traditional example of a rope being mistaken for a snake illustrates how things are posited through the force of ordinary innate conceptuality. This example is used in Tsongkhapa, as we saw, but it's also used in Chandrakirti, in a text that Tsongkhapa doesn't cite at that point. And it's like through study of these examples that His Holiness came to have this understanding that he talks about. So when the light is dim, you see a certain coiled shape and the variegated colors of the rope. And you think, there's a snake. But the color of the rope is not the snake. Its parts are not the snake. The whole collection of rope parts is not a snake. In fact, there's nothing there at all that is a snake. And while it seems very obvious, we can go through the individual parts and really feel this example. It has some red strands, yellow speckles. Each of those strands individually is non-snake. And the whole collection is non-snake. So in this case, the snake that's imagined there, there isn't any snake that we can find. There's only a mere designation by conceptuality in dependence on the rope. So like this, the thought I arises in relationship to the mind and body that are its bases of designation. But the mind is not the I, the body is not the I, and the collection of mind and body is not the I. It's the basis of designation of the I. The continuum of mind or body over time, or the collection, none of these is the I. They become bases of designation. So the collection of rope strands is not a snake. None of these bases of designation with respect to which we have the thought I actually is the I. Nor is there anything else that's a separate entity from all those that we can say is the I. Right now, we have a perception of I as blended with the mind and body, or its bases of designation, and we really can't tell one from the other. When mind and body appear, the I appears. When we look at the rope snake, there isn't some snake that's like a separate entity from the rope. It's just a rope that we've erroneously designated as a snake. So the key point is that there's no snake at all among the rope strand collection. And in that way, there is no I that we can find and point out among the collection of mental and physical parts. The I is merely designated by the mind. And when you understand this, it's stunning. It's like being hit by lightning. This is not to say that the person or the I is exactly like a rope snake. In the case of the rope snake, rope is the basis of designation for snake, but it's not a proper basis of designation. The coiled parts of a rope are not a proper basis of designation. They're the proper basis of designation of a rope. So, with regard to the rope, a snake does not exist there even conventionally. On the other hand, there is a conventionally existent person, a mere I. So what the example shows, intended to show, is the unfindability of the object designated among its bases of designation. It doesn't go to the question of whether the object designated exists or not. So the rope snake, is improperly imputed and doesn't actually exist. The I, can be properly imputed, but they're equal in terms of being unfindable among their bases of designation, right? Yeah, takes you have to. That's the point. That's the point. Right. Unfindability. So he's going to say, okay, it's easy for us to think about how you can't find a snake among the parts, the rope snake's parts, right? The rope's down there, and we're mistaking it as a snake. Right. So we're obviously not going to find any snake down there, right? But the point is, this there's a wrong conception that's thinking that there's a snake there, and there isn't any snake there anywhere among the bases of designation. So that's the piece of the example that we're supposed to be carrying over to the I, the unfindability among the bases of designation. And so he'll go on to say, suppose that there's a snake. The snake is equally unfindable among its bases of designation as it is among the rope pieces. You can't, but there's a big difference. One's functions as a snake and is correctly there's a correct designation of it as a snake in relationship to the basis of imputation, and the other one isn't. But when it comes to this issue of unfindability of the object designated among the bases of designation, they're exactly equal. And that's what he's trying to do, is take something where we obviously know that there's no snake there and say, just as much as there's no snake there in a rope snake, there's no snake that you're going to find in the bases, the bits of the snake either. And that's how it is with everything.
So it's not that the conception of the snake on the rope, the appearance of snake, the conceptual image of a snake in my mind on the rope, and the appearance of snake in my mind when I view a snake. Mm-hmm. It's not that those two conceptions are equal.
That's right.
It's the unfindability of both.
That's why I wanted to read this, because I think Jeffrey makes this. Yeah. He describes exactly what the example of the rope snake is supposed to mean and what it's not supposed to mean in a way that you don't actually find in the other texts. So if you have a rope snake, someone else could come along with a flashlight and say, hey, there's no snake here at all, and that person would be right. But if someone came along and said there's no person here at all because the I can't be found among its basis of designation, that person would be wrong. And actually there are people who think that that's what the Madhyamaka view is. So take the written word love, L-O-V-E. What's the basis of designation of the word love? The L, is L the basis of designation? And we might feel, please, we've already done this. Don't ask me any more of those questions. Is O the basis of designation? Is V the basis of designation? It says, is it E? He said, we might get a feeling that after E, there's not going to be anything else coming along, so the E must be the basis of a designation. We're not going to have anything else to point out, but this can't be completely right. And so there's a word love that's designated in relationship to a certain arrangement of these letters, but we can't find the word love, among those letters, or even in a randomly distributed collection of them, right? Yeah. So, we can say, in a sense, that this hand is body. but my hand is not the body that has a trunk and a head and limbs. Or you could have it say about one slice of a banana, is this banana? And again, we can say it is banana, conventionally correctly, but it's a different usage. It is not the banana that we peeled before we made that slice. One drop of milk is definitely milk, but it's not a gallon of milk, right? A slice of bread is bread, but it's not a loaf of bread, and neither are any of the other slices. We can't find the loaf in there. So likewise, one slice of banana is not the banana that's 8 inches long. When we speak of the substance banana, not the object banana, then the basis of designation is different, and we would have to think about what that is. Mushiness, yellow, certain smell, actually. Yeah, it has a smell, yeah. Similarly, if the object designated is space, we have to be really careful what we mean. Are we talking about a certain area? Like the space or area of this room could be divided up into parts, and we could take those parts as the basis of a designation for the space in this room. Okay, so it's 6:56, and I wanted to leave time for questions. I'll just maybe summarize what Jeffrey says in the last part. The next section is about partless particles and how there can't be any. And yet some, Madhyamaka rejects them, and some schools claim there be. And then sometimes when you read articles about physics, they say now we finally found the building block, the fundamental basis of, so the assumption is that everything is made out of matter, and if we could just break it into smaller and smaller pieces, we'll get to something that's real. Like battleships aren't real, but maybe quarks are. If they're not, then strings are. Or like maybe the left half of the string would, I don't know, whatever's inside a string. I have no idea. But it's clear to me that if you call something a string and it's making a quark, which is making a proton, the string extends, and so it has a left end and a right end, and it can't just exist as a thing in itself. So, so he talks about that a little bit, and then he says, the terrible difficulty is this all seems horribly intellectual. What does it have to do with how we suffer and live? Aren't we just supposed to flow with natural reality without all this thinking? It definitely goes against the grain to do all this thinking that's undermining, the way we just feel things are. But we have to do this. We have to recognize and systematically undermine our deeply ingrained assent to the seemingly natural status of things as independent. To get into the natural flow of things, how things actually are, we first have to see that this flow is made possible only because things lack the independent status we attribute to them. I like that sentence because he's sort of saying, there is a way of going with the flow. If you know what the flow actually is, and we don't. Right. I'm going to, Jeffrey talks about his attachment to frozen yogurt for a while, and I'll just read the last paragraph. So it will not work to just learn this terminology and engage in a little bit of reflection. We're going to, sooner or later, have to study the great text of the Madhyamaka tradition and think about what they're saying. The Dalai Lama says, think, 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 over and over again. But maybe we've come to Buddhism to get some rest from endless thought, and now we're faced with this. So, for inspiration, we have to look at images of the Buddha in contemplation and maybe consider that he's thinking about basis of designation and object designated. And then form the thought, I want to do that. Those who are successful at this are not those who vainly set out to win public debates or score points in scholarly discourse. You have to cultivate a strong wish to penetrate the nature of things. And along with it, you have to develop intense love and compassion for other beings and see that it is just this kind of analysis that will enable you to help them. We help living beings in distress, even saving a bug from water. And we engage in an ethical life and practice patience and make effort and learn to focus our minds in meditation. And all of this helps open up our minds and strengthens them so it becomes easier to engage in the analysis that actually penetrates the nature of things. Yeah. So, question time. Seven o'clock. Do we have questions? Yes, Nathan? Yeah. I'll try to, I should be repeating them, right, after Nathan says, yeah. Okay.
Okay. When you said initially, like, this table is not made of atoms, right? So, when I hear it, I hear that it's the table part and all the concepts and everything that we're trying to label on it, that's just a table. So could you then say, like, this thing or, like, this collection of things is made out of atoms, and that would be correct or incorrect?
Anything.
Without imputing tableness.
Right. Well, this is an oral teaching, and the key point of it is the phrase made out of. It's like, how are things established? How do things exist? That was what Geshe Benden Takpa was getting at with me. It's like, there are atoms, there are conglomerations of atoms, there are molecules, there are tissues, there are tables, but they don't have any way of being on their own side. So if you say, like a molecule is made out of atoms, it's just as the same as saying the table's made out of atoms, right? None of the atoms, it's just like a dozen eggs, none of the atoms and you can have atoms spread out, and none of them, they don't make the molecule, and the shape isn't that. So it's like, it's a molecule. If there is a correct basis of designation of a molecule that is there, then we can talk about a molecule, but it's from a point of view. There's like lots of different points of view, that would also be correct. That's what's so, where you start. So anyway, I found that useful to me, to think that all these things are here, but when we start thinking of, like, oh, my body is made out of something, what we should be thinking is, tissues or organs are the basis of designation of my body. My body is part of the basis of designation of Guy. But when we just think, I'm made out of stuff, we miss the point that you don't actually have anything. You can't actually talk about anything being anything except if you include a perspective. That's how I have understood it. So how can there be external things, and yet they're completely dependent on the mind? In the Yogacara system, they sort of say, things are one entity with the mind, and so that's why we have these kinds of phenomena. Yeah. But in this system, they're saying, no, they're external phenomena. But the point is that even though they're external, you can't say what they are except by talking about, they aren't anything in particular, except insofar as you're talking about what they are or aren't from a particular point of view. That's the best I can say that, yeah.
So can you also get at that kind of thinking if you think about something and then think about different beings looking at it, like an ant looking at me versus the cat versus Marga?
Yeah, I do that a lot. It helps me because, and then the thing to remember is that, the ant and the cat, we're going to assume that, they have, their sense powers intact. They're not cats who've been fed LSD or whatever. You know what I'm saying? So you have a normal cat with sense faculties that come about as a result of cat karma, and then how that cat sees the world, which we can't really imagine exactly, right? We just tried a little bit, but how that cat sees the world is a correct way to see the world. And it's superimposed in a sense, like I imagine it's like all these worlds are like just overlapping. Like people talk about different dimensions and so forth. Well, this is a way to think about that. Like, yeah, there are different things that are here, at the same time, externally. it's not a mystical thing. It's the fact that there's correct perspectives that constitute the world differently, because they're participating. It's not that there's just a world out there, and I always think, my first thing is, well, of course, they would see it in some crazy way because it's a spider, has spider karma. But unless the spider's been damaged in its vision, then its way. This is hard to say, but the spider's way of seeing is just as good as mine. And you know what I'm saying? It doesn't have anything basically less true about it, right? Yeah. And that's if you think that. So I do exactly that. Yeah. Because let me say a little more about that. So the traditional example is, instead of using different kinds of animals, you have gods, ghosts, and humans going down the river. And so, but this example is used in a lot of different tenet systems. It's not just a prasangika example. And one of the things you could think is to say, well, it's clear that there's really something there that has the character of fluidity. Mm-hmm. There's something that from its own side has a character of fluidity. Mm-hmm. And then it's constituted as not ambrosia, nectar or pus, from the point of view of the karma of different beings. But conventionally speaking, from its own side, it has the character of fluidity. That, at least as best I understand, that's the view that Tsongkhapa attributes to Svatantrika, SVA, that one. Svatantrika, nothing ultimate. We won't find some essentially existent water in the river, right? But there is something there, without having to involve talking about us, conventionally existent fluidity there, that for us is water and for the god is nectar. So that's the way in Svatantrika you get this idea that at the conventional level, things have some character from their own side. And that it's not that the mind doesn't participate in it, but it's a collaboration because there's something real from the own side. Yeah.
And something real that's also different from if they were all looking at a big vat of tea.
Yeah.
I mean, the water's different to the tea, isn't it? I mean, are they seeing, you know what I mean? Like, is it plain water or is it water with tea in it? That makes it different as well. You see what I'm saying?
Actually not. I don't quite get it.
No, it's okay. I'm probably just confused. It's okay.
But I have this question about the fluidity too, and so it's like, where does the idea of suitability come from?
Right.
What makes this
a suitable basis of designation?
What makes the parts of the snake a suitable basis of designation for the label snake?
Right.
When all those little rope parts are not a suitable designation for the snake.
Yeah. Well, I know this is the problem between Svatantrika and Prasangika, and I guess I would say that all of the bases of designation have themselves been designated, and there isn't anything there on the object side. But actually, we got stuck on the same point when I did this whole thing before. Right. Like, how do we determine a suitable basis of designation versus an unsuitable basis of designation, right? Without going out checking.
As a snake, but what is that?
Right.
The snake functions as a snake. The rope doesn't function as a snake.
Right. Yeah. I agree. No, I really don't know anything else to say about it. That's as far as I feel like each year or two I get a centimeter farther, and I feel like in the way I explained it this time was a little bit better than the last time and the time before, but I still don't understand it really fully. This is Tsongkhapa says this, and the Dalai Lama says it. Tsongkhapa says, it may be really hard to understand this, but you should just start by saying, this is the Madhyamaka system, even though I don't understand it. As Jeffrey said it too, he said, okay, we don't have to agree with this, but we should at least start by getting the words in the right order. Yeah. So, we're trying to get to that point. Yes.
Just on that subject of the suitability and the basis, I'm just thinking of this moment that happened in this room that I found quite disturbing. So I was with these small children, remember with our meditation with the kids, and one of them looked at the medicine Buddha Tanka and said, "That is a demon." No, that's the medicine Buddha. And now let me teach you the mantra.
Yeah.
Just that moment of,
Right.
And how do I prove that this exists from its side, that this is the medicine? I mean, that's the only way I can teach this idea.
Right. Well, okay. So I would say that this is not exactly what we're talking about, but because to just make it grosser, like suppose the children saw a muskrat in the woods and said, "Oh, there's a cat." Do you see what I'm saying? It's like this. That is conventionally, there's a convention in which we become educated about what are suitable bases of designation for ropes, snakes, cats, Buddhas, demons, and like we start out ignorant about how all those conventions work, and then we get educated into when we're supposed to say what. And then once we're educated, then it goes, and then it starts to seem like it's coming from over there. And that's the kind of thing that they're really talking about, is when you get to the point, like, so you're saying, no, you're wrong, it's not a demon. It's like a Buddha, it's a Buddha from its own side. Well, that's the part that's right. It's like, it's not that, them thinking it's a demon is the misconception. It's a gross misconception. But the subtler misconception is you're thinking that it's a Buddha from its own side, right? And actually, you should say, that's the correct basis of designation for a Buddha, not for a demon. Although I don't know how, maybe kids are better at this than we think, with the fingers and stuff like that. That Jeffrey was certainly, and his next door neighbor kid apparently too.
So the question you just talked about, is it like how a thing becomes that thing?
The suitability.
How a thing becomes that thing. A thing becomes that thing.
Why that thing on the floor became a snake? Is it what you're talking about? How it became a snake?
Yes. It's not a snake from everybody's point of view. I'm serious. It's a snake from our point of view, and that's correct to designate it as a snake. The snake probably has a different way of understanding the world, and so do the bats and the little mites, and they can have a correct perspective of their own. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like I was thinking about this. Do you know what a mite is? It's like these really, really tiny things, you can barely see them. I was thinking about so if, when we say dog, but what if there's a mite on the dog, and so from if we really kind of get our minds around that the mite's point of view is just as correct as ours, we have to really, understand that, so what do you say? If we just try to translate the mite's perspective into ours, we would have to say, feast, a forest or a feast. It's a forest or a feast, or I don't know, however mites, maybe it just goes, you know what I'm saying? It's like, it doesn't think dog. You know what I'm saying? It's just like,
Guys, watching cartoons, that will have.
Anyway, yeah, that's what I've thought about. It's like, so it's, there's different kinds of things in the world, but for them to be talked about as this particular thing or that one, you have to think about from whose point of view are you discussing? We tend to just always assume that the human point of view is right, and and it could be if it's not discredited, by ultimate reasoning. Like if I say, oh, that mountain's just the same as yesterday, then we don't have to realize emptiness to realize that that's wrong. We can demonstrate that there's been some subtle change since yesterday. Or if I say I really inherently exist, then maybe to discredit that, we would have to realize emptiness, right? But there's other things that aren't discredited about, how we. That's what Jeffrey's mainly talking about. We make these correct imputations, and then the problem is not that we've done that, it's that we think things are like that from their own side. And the way that, what he's doing is, there's two ways to do that. One is to try to look for the object designated among its bases of imputation. That's what Jeffrey's doing this whole chapter, and that's what most of the reasonings are about. Say, okay, feels like there's a real temple over there. Let's go and look for it among the bases of designation of temple, and then we realize that it's not that, and Tsongkhapa talks in different parts of the book. He talks about when people really do this analysis well, and they reason carefully about this, they come to a place where they experience, the utter unfindability of the temple or whatever, and then they think, it has to be this. This doesn't have any way of existing. It just seems to exist, but when you dig down, it doesn't really have any way of existing. And it must be true, of all these things. We can do that with, and then I could do that with myself and see, and it would be the same as with the temple. And then but if that were true, who would be doing this analysis? Mm-hmm. And so, he goes through this whole thing and says, this is how people get stuck, and they're like, well, I can't find a temple, I can't find the table, I can't find the dog, I can't find the person who's doing the analysis. None of those things seem to have any way of existing, but I'm still doing the analysis. So, I guess I will just say the mode of being of phenomena is inexpressible. That's the way, right? Yeah. Yes.
Is it correct to say that the thing you're negating is a conception?
Yeah. Yes. Some people use different words, but it seems very clear that Tsongkhapa and also sources that he's quoting in Chandrakirti, use the word conception. As the ignorance. Ignorance is a misconception. So I know, Bob Thurman has truth habits, and that's Denzin, which Jeffrey would translate as the conception of true existence. Mm-hmm. That's the same as truth habit. So the word zin there does mean apprehend or grasp, and in other contexts it could refer to the process of perceiving something as green.
I'm asking the questions because on one hand that word seems to imply the apprehended object, and then when you say conception, it seems like it's more on the subject side, and this is where the mind wants to split it into the object or the subject.
So the conception, the ignorance is on the subject side,
Right.
and so is the correct conceptual consciousness that's imputing table, right? And they're right together. Like good tissue and cancer, and it's all mixed together. It's like that. So you need a really skilled surgeon. And need somebody to teach you how to pick that apart. Because there's correct designation of things, but for us it goes along with the sense that there's a thing is there from its own side. Yeah. Yes.
It's probably quick. If that's
Okay.
So let's say you have an enlightened individual and somebody who's not.
Uh-huh.
They're both looking at the same thing.
Uh-huh.
Both of their perspectives valid.
Say that again.
Like if you have an enlightened individual and somebody who's not, and they're both looking at the same thing, like the God looking at water and an individual, are they both valid? Like is it?
Oh yeah. So can you substitute for God like a super mundane deity?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, In Tsongkhapa's system, you have to say that just ordinary beings like us, unless our sense faculties are impaired, have conventionally correct information about the world. How would the enlightened beings see some? Well, if we go to different levels of enlightenment, let's say if you have a person who's, on the uninterrupted path of the path of seeing and is directly realizing emptiness, then they're sitting right there with the tables and the chairs, and none of them appear at all. And where we're sitting right here are the tables and chairs, and we don't see anything that they're seeing. But these two perspectives, according to Tsongkhapa, do not contradict each other. Very important point. I do it like in Introduction to Emptiness is 2 radio channels, right? We're on All Things Considered, and then the uninterrupted path of seeing, you switch over to All Emptiness All the Time radio. And you can't be on both at the same time unless you're a Buddha. But they don't discredit each other. And this is sort of a key feature of Tsongkhapa's system. It's how he's able to preserve conventionalities. He's saying, conventional things exist conventionally, and emptiness exists conventionally, right? There's nothing that exists ultimately. And so if we look under a microscope, we see certain things, and if we point a telescope in exactly the same direction, it's not the same. But it's like that. It's like that. Or you can have a certain small situation, and you can invite, an economist, a sociologist, a psychologist, all in and give, accurate scientific descriptions that are just looking at the situation from completely different points of view. It's like a framework, right? And so that's the idea, is that we're stuck on this way of just seeing all these different things but not tuning into their fundamental nature. When you realize their fundamental nature and directly, not just understand it, for a time everything else vanishes and you only see emptiness. Then when you come out of that, you see these things again, but they have a kind of illusory like quality. And why? That's because they're appearing, they actually appear to you as inherently existent, just like they do to us, even after you've realized emptiness. But you no longer believe in that appearance in the same way. And when you go along like that until you're completely out of cyclic existence, you're an 8th ground bodhisattva, say, but you're not a Buddha. Then when you're not meditating on emptiness, you still see this stuff, and you don't see emptiness. You still have to see one or the other. But when you're on the All Things Considered channel, you're like, it doesn't even occur to you for a second to think of those things as having some status from their own side. And I always understand this in terms of, looking at myself in the mirror, which like there's a guy in there, do you know what I'm saying? It's like, if you can somehow set aside your trained intelligence, you can get into a certain space where, that really looks like a person. You know what I'm saying? It does. The appearance is vividly that of a person, especially if the mirror is clean, right? And it can be very vivid if you have a really good mirror and it's really clean. But we've trained, to not even think for a second. We do not. There's this false appearance. It still appears to people who are outside of cyclic existence. Bodhisattvas are outside of cyclic existence. They still have this false appearance, but it's just sort of like me seeing my reflection in the mirror. It doesn't even occur to them for a second to assent to that false appearance. It wouldn't dawn, because they've completely rooted that out. But the problem is, because they still have that false appearance of inherent existence, they can't be on both channels at once. And so, a fully enlightened Buddha would still sees conventional things, but is simultaneously able to see their ultimate nature. That's the idea. And not get them mixed up. There's a lot of tricks there. Yeah, it takes a while. Yeah, thank you, everybody. We should... Well, let's dedicate any merit that may come to us through this engagement with the Dharma today. First of all, to the ultimate welfare of everyone listening here today, and then to the ultimate welfare of all of their mothers.